Grace Jackson is the co-host of Literary Hangover, and we don't have a one sheet for tonight. This is, I don't know if you know this, but we're running on bare bones until after Labor Day.
Mm,
So I don't know what you want to talk about.
okay.
What would you like to talk about?
Well, I was going to say a few things about the white paper that China released a couple of weeks ago on Taiwan. It's only the third white paper they've released on the Taiwan question. And they released it in response to Nancy Pelosi's visit. So I thought I could do a little follow-up on that.
Yeah. What is a white paper? What does that mean?
It's basically a policy paper that lays out their position on a particular issue, and they've sort of used it in the past to clarify their position following particular events. So they released one in 1993 and another in 2000 on Taiwan. And it basically just lays out their position, goes over some historical questions and the reasons that they hold the position that they do on Taiwan. It was kind of intended to basically clarify the way they think about Taiwan in the wake of Pelosi's visit and this concern about the gradual erosion of the US's one China policy, not to be confused with the one China principle, but
Right.
We can get into that later.
Please.
So this white paper, a lot of it was stuff that we've seen before. It kind of reiterated a lot of the familiar concepts and messages that the PRC has around Taiwan, but there were a few notable differences and a few significant things that were different. So they stated in this white paper that they would not renounce the use of force, and they would reserve the option of any necessary measure in order to achieve reunification with Taiwan. Now that's not new. They've said similar things like that before.
They would. What about reunificate? What?
So in order to achieve reunification, China has said they will not renounce the use of force. So basically, if it comes to it, they will use force in order to achieve that goal.
Right.
And that is not a new thing. That has been, they've stated that several times in the past decade. But there was something slightly new about the formulation in this white paper. So previously, in the other two white papers on Taiwan, the PRC had said explicitly, we will not send troops or administrative personnel to be based in Taiwan upon reunification, basically meaning that they wouldn't occupy Taiwan after unification. And this kind of signaled that Taiwan would enjoy potentially quite a high degree of autonomy after unification. Now that line has been removed in this most recent white paper. And that, to me, indicates that the PRC is actually thinking more about potentially how they would govern Taiwan should reunification be achieved. Because it's one thing to kind of take Taiwan or to bomb it into submission, to kind of win a military victory. It's quite another to govern a population that doesn't really want to be governed by the PRC, which we do know is the case in Taiwan.
Yeah, let me just ask you this. Taiwan does not want to be taken over by the PLC. There are some elements, I would assume, within Taiwan, but for the most part, a majority does not want mainland China to run Taiwan.
Yes, according to polling, the overwhelming majority of Taiwanese people want the status quo to continue. Most of them don't want Taiwan to declare independence right now, and most of them also don't want reunification, or as I would call it, unification, because Taiwan has never actually been governed by the PRC. It's been administered by the Qing dynasty, but those are different political entities, so I prefer to call it unification, or as the PRC would call it, reunification.
I'm sorry to interrupt you for 1 second. I just want to.
Mm.
Taiwan is not threatening mainland China. Economically, maybe? Is there?
Well, with the recent kind of semiconductor situation, there's a sense in which Taiwan is being forced to choose between mainland China and the US in terms of where it's going to do its business with semiconductors. And in my last segment, I talked about how huge of the global share in semiconductors Taiwan has through TSMC, this one very big corporation. But it's certainly not threatening the PRC in any tangible way.
So is there a natural resource that mainland China is yearning for?
Well, not a natural resource, but semiconductors. I think there's a strong attraction to Taiwan's very highly developed semiconductor supply chain.
I think they use mainland China as for factories, and don't they employ people?
Yeah, there's a lot of actual manufacturing done in China by companies that are headquartered in Taiwan. There is quite a lot of manufacturing done in Taiwan of semiconductors as well. It's the case that a lot of Taiwanese made semiconductors end up being shipped to the mainland, where they are then assembled into iPhones and other, electronic gadgets that end up in the US and in Europe.
So they are trading partners. They get along.
Absolutely. Oh, well, trading partners, yes. Getting along is a slightly different question, but there's no doubt that Taiwan's semiconductor industry would really be, let's say, the jewel in the crown of PRC occupied Taiwan. There's a huge incentive there for China to take control of that supply chain. But just going back to the question of governance and, what Taiwanese people want or what they say they want, it's hard to imagine the PRC governing Taiwan in a really effective and, smooth way, because right now, as I mentioned, the polls suggest that Taiwanese people want the status quo to continue. They don't want independence, at least not immediately. They don't want unification. There is a small contingent of people who favor both immediate independence and immediate unification, but it's vanishingly small. Those are the people that probably we saw protesting against Pelosi's visit, the Taiwanese people who came out against that. But yeah, it's interesting that this white paper that China just released does kind of hint by omission, at least by omitting that line about not stationing administrative personnel in Taiwan, that a military occupation or even an extended military occupation is being at least countenanced. So I wanted to kind of pivot from that and talk a little bit about another constituent in Taiwan, the indigenous people. So
can I ask just
sure.
Please.
Yeah.
I have two follow-up. Please hold the thought about the indigenous people. One is, I would assume China governs differently in different territories. The way they govern Tibet is different from the way they govern Hong Kong, and they would govern Taiwan differently than how they would govern Hong Kong, or would it be similar?
That's a good question. That's a very pertinent question. So China indeed governs in different ways in different territories. So Tibet is a special autonomous region, as is Xinjiang, where the Uyghurs are. Inner Mongolia also has a similar setup, and I think Guangxi province as well, which is very rural in the southwest. So there are different kind of modes of governance and levels of autonomy granted.
And different languages and different ethnicities and different.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, Hong Kong is probably the most relevant example here, and it's also the outlier in terms of governance, I would say. So many listeners will be familiar with the concept of one country, two systems, which was promised to Hong Kong as a way for Hong Kong to maintain its capitalist and kind of somewhat liberal way of life when Hong Kong was returned to China by the British in 1997. So it was designed to allow Hong Kong, and Macau had a similar thing, which was a Portuguese colony, to preserve its separate system, but still to kind of be a part of China, the country. Now that one country, two systems has been touted to the Taiwanese by the Chinese leadership. And in fact, it was mentioned in the white paper. Xi Jinping has said repeatedly that one country, two systems is going to be the best thing for Taiwan in the long run, that it would safeguard the interests and well-being of Taiwanese compatriots, to quote him. But there is an issue with that, because in 2019, China decided to introduce the national security law in Hong Kong. And that's what triggered those very significant protests. I believe the law was actually withdrawn in response to the protests by the local Hong Kong legislature, by the local Hong Kong government, but then it was imposed the following year in 2020. And it has changed the status quo in Hong Kong significantly, not economically, we should add. So economically speaking, financially speaking, Hong Kong is still the same business-friendly, low-tax place that it was.
Center for capitalism. I mean,
a center for capital, exactly, and the flow of capital. But politically, it has changed beyond recognition. I can go into, how it has changed, but
I'd be curious.
Sure. Well, the national security law basically criminalizes dissent and adopts extremely broad definitions of things like terrorism, subversion, secession, and collusion with foreign powers. So it expands the definition of all of those crimes. It allowed Beijing to establish its own security force in Hong Kong. Under the law so far, like several hundred people have been arrested and thousands more have been arrested simply for their participation in the protests. So newspapers have closed, journalists and publishers have been jailed, a few very sort of high profile ones. And in 2021, separate from the national security law, Beijing overhauled Hong Kong's electoral system. So prior to this, from 1997, when Hong Kong was returned to China, there was a thing called the Basic Law, it served as Hong Kong's kind of mini constitution. It replaced the British colonial law. And under the Basic Law, Hong Kongers were supposedly going to get freedom of the press, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion. Now, Beijing always had the right to interpret the Basic Law, and there were certain things in the Basic Law that were intentionally vague. So it did state that the ultimate aim for Hong Kong was to have its leader, its chief executive, elected by a popular vote, but there was no deadline for that in the Basic Law. Now, since 2021, when this overhaul of the electoral system happened, basically, there are new rules about who can run for election in Hong Kong. Only quote unquote patriots who respect the Chinese Communist Party are allowed to run in elections. There was only one candidate that was allowed to run for the chief executive position, a guy called John Lee, who happened to be a hardline former police chief who was in charge of putting down the protests in 2019. And prior to this, about half of the Legislative Council's members were elected directly, and the rest were chosen by industry groups or professional groups. And now only 20 are directly elected, and that's if they even make the ballot. If they're not patriotic, if they don't respect the party, they're not even going to make it to the ballot. So a lot has changed. Many political parties have kind of folded since then. A lot of people have been jailed. A lot of these dissenting voices have been silenced. So one country, two systems is turning out to be, quite conducive to the maintenance of capital-friendly conditions in Hong Kong. But the other part of that, which was the kind of liberal democratic ideal, supposedly, that Hong Kong was going to be allowed to pursue, that hasn't held up so well. So Taiwanese people look at this and they think, well, there's not that much for us in this system, I think.
Interesting. Let's go to indigenous.
Yeah, well, it's connected. Indigenous people, so they're a very small part of Taiwan's population. They're about 2.5%. However, scholars think that they've probably been on the island of Taiwan for about 6,000 years.
Oh, this is really interesting.
Yeah, based on the diversity of the languages that they speak.
Do they look, I would assume they look different?
Yeah, they do look a bit different from, what we would think of as the sort of Han Chinese ethnicity, I suppose. But most interestingly, they all speak different languages, dozens of different languages, Austronesian languages.
They know they know they're indigenous, right?
Yeah, oh yeah, yeah.
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Yeah, so they do know they're indigenous. However, as with all of these types of situations, the ways in which they've been categorized has been heavily informed by colonial administration on Taiwan over the centuries. So when the Japanese administered Taiwan, when they occupied Taiwan, they had their own approach to indigenous peoples and categorizing them. Same for the KMT when they came to Taiwan. So it's a fluid and kind of ongoing and contested definition. There are many people who are not considered officially indigenous, who would like to be recognized officially as indigenous in Taiwan. So there's a whole kind of politics of indigeneity in Taiwan at the moment. But the point is that there's more and more recognition now, and with the current government on Taiwan, indigenous people are gaining recognition and representation within the government. And I just wanted to, I guess I'll end on this.
Hang on for one second. This is, so the indigenous people on Taiwan, has their fate been as similar to the indigenous people in, say, America, Canada?
Yeah.
In what way? Explain that, like how are they, so they are class citizens? Have they always, you say it's been different with each different colonizing empire?
Yeah, each kind of colonizing force on Taiwan, and there have been many of them, has dealt with the indigenous peoples in their own way. But a common theme is subjugation. I mean, especially under the Japanese, the Japanese treatment of the indigenous peoples was especially brutal. And in fact, there are some very interesting and kind of paradoxical currents in Taiwanese politics today around indigenous people identifying perhaps more with the KMT, with the nationalists who came to Taiwan by virtue of the fact that they got rid of the Japanese. It's very complicated and I don't want to misrepresent it, but I do want to just note.
Sorry, this is so fast. Chiang Kai-shek, KMT.
Yeah.
He was not from Taiwan. He was from.
No, he was from the mainland.
And so when they all went to Taiwan, they got rid of the Japanese, or no, this was 48, right?
Well, this was 47, but after the war, after the Japanese surrendered in World War II, obviously they lost their claim to Taiwan, and it was returned to the Republic of China. And that's when Chiang Kai-shek went to Taiwan with the remnants of his nationalist forces,
So
1 million or 2
Taiwan,
million of them.
is it a nation of immigrants? Is that how, despite the 2% indigenous, do they think of themselves as a nation of immigrants?
It doesn't have, I mean, yes and no. I think there isn't quite the same discourse of the melting pot that the United States has, but it's getting there. And actually more and more, and you see this in the newer museums in Taiwan, the National Museum of Taiwan History, for example, there's a narrative emerging of Taiwan as a multicultural place where civic participation is defined more by things like voting and having kind of democratic values than it is by your blood, by your skin color, you know, your ethnicity, or even your language. And so if you ride the subway in Taipei, you'll hear the announcements in several different languages, you know, Mandarin, English, Hakka. I think there's one other indigenous language. I don't have the list to hand, but it is a polyglot place.
And English is, you will have no problem. You lived in Taiwan for 2 years.
Yeah.
If you didn't speak fluent Mandarin, could you have gotten by just speaking English?
You can get by, but you won't have the best time, and I had the best time.
Because you don't speak. Yeah, I see.
Right. You should speak Mandarin in Taiwan if you can. It's not, English is not quite at the second language level that I think the Taiwanese government would like it to be. They're actually promoting English as the second language of Taiwan at the moment. But if you can speak Mandarin, you'll just get so much more out of it. And then there's also the language. Taiwanese is a language. It's a variant of Southern Min from the southern part of China, which is where a lot of the immigrants to Taiwan came from in the 17th and 18th centuries.
Right.
So you've got just dozens of different influences. But before we go, I do want to just get to this.
Yes. Sorry.
The reason I brought the indigenous people up was because when you hear the Chinese government, for example, in this white paper, talk about the inevitability, the historical inevitability of reunification, it's very interesting to consider the perspectives of people who, by all accounts, have been on Taiwan for thousands of years, maybe 6,000 years. In 2019, a group of indigenous people represented by, what was it called? The Representatives of the Indigenous Peoples of Taiwan. It's a small kind of government body. They wrote an open letter to Xi Jinping in response to his address, where he had said, we're going to do one country, two systems in Taiwan. It's going to be great for everybody. And I read this letter and I thought it was very moving, actually. And I just wanted to read a short quotation from it, if I may.
Yeah.
So in this letter, they said, we've lived here in our motherland for more than 6,000 years. We are undoubtedly not ethnic minorities within the so-called Chinese nation. The stories passed down to us by our ancestors reveal that Taiwan is the traditional territory of this land's indigenous peoples. They go on. We, the indigenous peoples of Taiwan, have for centuries been enduring the deeds and sometimes the empty words of those who have pushed up onto our island's shores. This has resulted in us being forcibly repressed by colonialists and also by authoritarian regimes. The Spanish, the Dutch, the Zheng Kingdom, the Qing, the Japanese, and the Republic of China. They have all come here and they've all left their marks. We were even called barbarians and untamed savages. Now we are officially recognized as Taiwan's original occupants. Yes, we have fought against imperialism and every foreign intruder. And they say, this is a nation within which different groups of people are trying to understand each other's painful historical experiences. This is a nation within which we can tell our own stories and in our own languages. We have freedom and can decide the kind of country we aspire to have. We work hard to improve this. This is dignity. So I thought that was really interesting and a kind of helpful thing to consider against claims of, you know, history is destiny, historical inevitability that are always being offered by the PRC.
Great.
I hope that made sense.
Yeah, it was fantastic. And it is a subject that we need to pay attention to, obviously.
Yeah.
And it's, for lack of a better word, alien to most Americans. Grace Jackson is the co-host of Literary Hangover. I'm going to say you work our China desk. Is that good? That sounds like
that sounds great.
That sounds like on our China desk. I like that. And can we tell where you are?
Yeah, I'm in Vermont, in Bernie country, still looking for Bernie.
That's a novel that you should write. And people can follow you at Grace Jackson, listen to Literary Hangover, and hopefully we'll see you either in Vermont or Brooklyn.
Yeah, come visit.